Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Matrix-12-V tutorial series. I'm going to be having a look at the LFO section today, low frequency oscillators. Here it is, there's some stuff in the page 2 section as well for us to dive into. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to do that, and an enormous thanks to everybody who's signed up so far. I really appreciate it. Okay, without further ado, let's get on with it. The LFOs in this synthesizer are a pure modulation source. Occasionally, you will have audible LFOs on synths. That's not the case here. And as you can see, we've got 5 of them to play with. As usual with these demonstrations, I'm going to predominantly concentrate on modulating the pitch today because it's really easy to identify. And we're just basically going to concentrate on LFO1, but the same principles apply to each of the different oscillators. What we've basically got is a shape, a waveform, that's going to be used as a modulation source on a periodic basis. And this is the critical difference between LFOs and envelopes. LFOs and envelopes are the two most important modulation sources, and they're really fundamentally different in terms of envelopes are intended to be a one-shot deal. They do something once and then they're done. LFOs are designed to be repeating modulation sources, and the reason why most synthesizers have LFOs is because the low frequency nature of them, the fact that they cycle very slowly, is ideal for modulation. Let's get one up and running as quickly as possible so that I can demonstrate the basic principles, and then we'll have a look at the settings. So I'm going to use a triangle wave to modulate the VCO1 pitch. VCO1 frequency is already selected, but I could simply click in the yellow description in the VCO to get it there. And then I'm going to tie LFO1 to it maximally. Don't forget to turn the modulation amount up. Now at the moment that LFO is not going to have any impact because the amplitude of the low frequency oscillator is at 0. So here's our static note. Turn the amplitude up, however. Now the pitch is being modulated very quickly using a triangle wave. If we slow it down, we'll hear that much more easily. And that's the basic principles of a low frequency oscillator. That thing is cycling slightly slower than once a second, perhaps. And there, as we get to the point where we're modulating it much more quickly, much more frequently, we get back into the FM territory that we were talking about when we discussed the FM module itself, oscillating the pitch so quickly that it takes on a different aspect. You can no longer hear the individual modulations, and it becomes really a different beast. Predominantly, we're talking about much slower oscillations than that. So I'll wander through some of the wave shapes we've got to play with. Square is going to give you I call it the ambulance effect, which is basically on, off, on, off. Upsaw and downsaw are pretty self-explanatory. Here's the up. Something interesting to note actually, while we're just stuck on the upsaw, I'll just speed it up a little bit. Every time I press a key, we start from a different point on the curve. So there was an E, there was an F sharp, and there was an F sharp again, randomly, and G that time. That's because the LFO is cycling in the background. It's independent of the key presses. We'll be able to manipulate that using the page 2 settings. That's our Retrig mode, but let's just stick up top for now. Here's our downsaw. Pretty obvious. Random, the synthesizer will choose its own pitch. Speed this up, we're going to get chatter. Now noise takes the concept of random one step further, because not only will the modulation amount, which at the moment is being tied into pitch, that's going to be random, but the amount of time in between each of the modulations will also be random. In other words, when you've got noise selected, the speed function is disabled. It would be nice if it was grayed out, but it isn't. It's got nothing to do with anything, and you're going to get something that approximates a completely random time and modulation amount based change to the frequency, and that's going to result in something pretty unpleasant. And as you can see, it doesn't matter what I do with the speed dial. Now, sample and hold is another special modulation type, and a new value just appeared in the box. We've got this input option now, and we've got all these different input options to choose from. Basically, whatever you choose as your input, so at the moment I've chosen keyboard, as we discussed in detail when we talked about the lag processor. Every key on the keyboard has its own modulation control voltage. That's what's being fed into the LFO. So any key that I press, if I press a C2, you're going to get the note itself, which is C2, with an additional amount of modulation being supplied by whatever that control voltage happens to be. And in that case, it's translating to an F sharp. If I press, so that's what, 6 semitones higher? If I press a C an octave higher, the modulation amount is going to be an equivalent amount greater, basically 1 octave's worth, and we're going to get it pushed past the F sharp that we saw earlier. And now we're up to G. So every octave that I go up, this will be a G sharp or an A. There we go. Do you hear that little step that it went from one point to another? That's because the oscillator is still cycling in the background. It's still outputting the control voltage from its last input, which in that case was the C3. When I press C4, I briefly get a little bit of the previous modulation amount, and then the sample and hold takes a new snapshot. Imagine it periodically taking photographs. I try to think of it as literal snapshots of whatever control voltage is being input to it. And so you hear that little step up. Now, depending on where the LFO is in its cycle, sometimes you'll hear a very small step up, and sometimes it'll be a bit bigger. If I slow the LFO down, we should be able to accentuate that effect a little bit. So there we just got F sharp. There was no modulation to that at all. There was our step up. At which point you should be hearing the screeching of brakes in your brain. Hang on a minute. If I'm pressing the same key on the keyboard, where are all these step-ups coming from? Why hasn't it already accepted that control voltage input from whatever C3 is submitting? Why is it that every time I press exactly the same key, we're hearing another modulation? Well, if I carry on pressing this key in the background while I'm talking to you, eventually that effect's going to go away. There we go. It took a while, but we got there. And now every single time I press the C3, a completely static tone is being output. The original C3 plus the modulation amount, which is resulting in that G. 10 points and a gold star for you if you can tell me what's gone on there. Yeah, it's once again the fact that every voice has its own LFO. They're basically 12 completely independent synthesizers. So as I was talking to you, pressing that key over and over again, what was actually happening was I was cycling through all 12 voices. Every single one of those voices has its own LFO with its own position, cycling in the background, doing its own thing. Eventually I got to the stage where all of them were outputting a C3. They all equalized their control voltage and they stopped having anything exciting to do. So if I now step back down to C2 again, there's the step down, and you're going to get 12 step downs until we've gone through all these 12 voices. Now this is going to cause us some trouble for the rest of this episode unless we do something about it. And a nice easy thing for me to do is switch to reset mode. And now I'll only use as many voices as I need. Every time I press a single key, we'll always be using voice 1. If I want to give you an example of something to do with chords, we're going to be using the first 3 voices. See how badly detuned that was? Because each of those notes have their own control voltage amount, modulating each one of those notes, those tones by a slightly different amount. It is a beast of a synthesizer, this one. There are so many different ways that you can just basically get confused when you're trying to figure out what's going on. So everything there that we dealt with was using the keyboard as an input, but another nice example to give you is velocity. So now I'm just going to basically press the same key every time. But I'm pressing it at different velocities, and each one of those velocities is resulting in a new control voltage. Of course, the old control voltage is still in memory, so we're going to have to wait to cycle around whatever period of time we've set by the speed dial in order to catch the next one. I've just turned the keyboard on to make this visually easy to follow, but I'm just pressing the same key at different velocities. So if I press it as quietly as I can, there's basically no modulation being applied. Now a nice hard key, and there's all that modulation being added. In order to demonstrate Retrigger, you can see I've set the wave mode back to triangle. Retrigger's a bit odd in this synthesizer. I'll explain what it does first, and then we'll have a look at some practical demonstrations. And in order to demonstrate this, I've had to change one of the page 2 settings. I've set Retrig mode to single. Now we're going to come back and have a look at Retrig mode a little bit later, but just for now, basically it means that every time I press a key on the keyboard, the same thing is going to happen to the LFO. It's going to start from the same point. So we'll start off nice and simple and just listen to it. Every time I press a key, it does exactly the same thing. Do you also notice that it's starting from the very highest modulation amount it can, the tip of the triangle? That's unusual. Ordinarily, I would expect a triangle wave to start at what traditionally would be 90 degrees, in other words, a 0 offset for the modulation amount, and then I would expect it to go up to the peak, down to 0, all the way down to what would effectively be -1, back up to 0, and then it's finished its wave. That's not the case here. It's starting from the very tip of the peak. That's what 0 means. If I turn Retrig up to 32, now it's going to be starting from the very lowest point of modulation. That's impossible to demonstrate if Retrig mode is off, because the oscillator is cycling in the background, completely detached from the keyboard, and so it's impossible for me to generate any kind of consistency with the keys that I press. I'm pressing the same key every time. Have a look on the keyboard. If you press lots of really quick notes, you can kind of do a join the dots thing where you can recreate the shape of the LFO in the background because you're jumping onto this moving train repeatedly with sufficient granularity for you to be able to figure out what the shape is. That's no good to us. We're trying to figure out what this Retrig knob does, and so I've had to set it into keyboard trigger mode, which means the keyboard itself is the thing that begins and initializes the wave. And so this Retrig knob basically allows you to set where that start point is. You've got this moving feast. Where on the shape of the wave do you want to begin your oscillation? And at 32, for a triangle wave, it's going to be at the lowest possible point it can be. Now 0, which is at the very tip of the peak, and 63 are identical because you've shifted your offset the entire size of the wave. In other words, you've come back to where you started. The start is the same as the end. They're identical points. But anywhere in between, you're setting a different point. We're nearly done with the upper section. I'll just set this back to 0. One more feature to look at, which is the sync lock. So if I press this little button, you get this curious kind of 1L, 1 pipe, 1 I. I don't know what those two symbols mean, but basically they're meaningless. As you click up and down on your knob, you can see that these first two symbols, they're indicating that you're in sync mode, but I haven't got a clue what they actually stand for. But anyway, that's locking it. It's locking the speed of the oscillator to your host tempo. If you want some kind of pumping effect that's perfectly in time with the beat of your song, this is a great way to do it. Turn it back off again, and we're back to our arbitrary 0 to 63, kind of meaningless number in its own right. You need to derive empirically what that number means. So sadly, we can't say something like cycle at 1.5 hertz. You're going to need to figure out what 1.5 hertz means according to the speed dial. Okay, now down to page 2. We've had some sneak previews of Retrig mode, but we'll leave that till last because there's a bit of an issue there. Let's have a look at this lag setting. This is an independent lag processor, so it doesn't use any of the settings from the lag processor. It's its own thing, and it's very subtle. If I set a square wave and get it going really pretty quickly, can you hear how sharp those changes of pitch are from one to the next? Now I'm going to engage lag, and you'll just hear a little bit of smoothing from all of those pitch changes. Like I said, it's pretty subtle. You've really got to crank the speed up quite high to be able to hear it at all. So this very, very gentle, very small smoothing of all of the edges. Now, if you want to use the full-blown lag processor, you can. So let's make the same connection from the LFO into VCO1 frequency, but this time we'll do it via the lag processor. So our input is going to be the LFO. This is how you insert the lag processor in between a source and a destination. We'll set the rate to something other than 0. Linear mode is fine. And now, instead of mapping the LFO directly to the VCO1 frequency, we map the lag processor to the VCO1 frequency instead. And so, there you can hear the lag processor doing its thing. If you want the really exaggerated, full-blown effect of the lag processor, you need to do it manually. This thing is just for very, very subtle, gentle shaping of the corners. Let's get us back to direct mapping LFO1 into VCO1 frequency. So we've taken the lag processor back out again. And finally, we'll finish with a conversation about this retrig mode. Well, we've already seen off, which is basically the LFO is completely independent in the background, doing its thing. We've also seen that in Retrig mode single, every time I press a key on the keyboard, the LFO will retrigger from wherever the offset is specified by this knob, also helpfully called Retrig. The issue comes that we have this Retrig mode called multi. Now, ordinarily, what I would expect between these two effects is that single would say all voices use the same oscillator. So if I press a slightly arpeggiated chord, that all three notes of that chord will basically lock together and they'll all use the same low frequency oscillator, whereas in multi-mode I could press the same arpeggiated chord and you'll hear each one of those offset notes and they'll all have their own independent oscillator. I can't get single and multi to do anything different. To me, they both sound like they're multi. So whether or not that's just me being dumb or whether there's an issue with the plugin, I don't know. I've got the latest version of Matrix-12. I'll demonstrate what I mean. So we'll stick to single mode. Don't forget, we're still in reset here. So if I press 3 notes, now I pressed all those 3 notes together and it sounds like they're using the same LFO, but they're not. I'll now press them staggered. Very clear that each one of those voices has its own low frequency oscillator. If we head back to multi-mode and I perform exactly the same test, I can't tell any difference between those two. They sound identical to me. I've tried it at all sorts of different speeds, all sorts of different voice options. I just can't get them to sound different. I thought it might be something to do with the Retrig knob needing to be set in a non-zero state, But to be absolutely honest with you, whatever I do always sounds the same. I've just set up some new random values here. Here's multi. Do exactly the same thing in single. Yeah, they both sound like multi-mode to me, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe that's just me being an idiot. Now, as I said at the beginning of the episode, most of the stuff that we've been talking about today has been involving the VCO1 frequency, but it absolutely doesn't need to. Let's tie into the VCF frequency instead, and we'll map that to LFO1. Full beans for the modulation, pull the frequency down so that the LFO's got something to play with, and let's give us an upsaw. So that's the upward slope of the LFO applying to the filter frequency in exactly the same way that it was to the pitch. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.